3, and we're going to start talking about something called complex numbers, which we're going to see include something called an imaginary number. So we're on the page 9 of this notes packet right here. So my first question is, if the square root of 1 is equal to 1, because 1 times 1, or 1 squared, is equal to a positive 1, what would be the square root of a negative 1? Question mark. Well, you might think that it's a negative 1. But if we multiply out a negative 1 times a negative 1, I have a negative times a negative, and that gives me a positive 1. So a real important understanding is that we cannot take the square root of a negative number, such as negative 1, and get a real number for an answer. What we're going to see is we get something called an imaginary number. If you try to find the square root of negative 1 in your calculator, you'll get an error that says non-real answer. And so that's your calculator telling you that you have something called an imaginary number. Okay? So what we say is, since we cannot get a real answer for the square root of negative 1, we are going to call that an imaginary number that we represent by the letter I. So I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay? So if we start off with I being the square root of negative 1, then I can do a bunch of calculations. Actually, I'm going to hold off for part 2 on this one.